Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to meet some new friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something along the way. I'm your host, Isaac Levin. And if you're enjoying the conversations here, be sure to like, subscribe, or follow me on all the different social media platforms I got. The easiest way to find them is you can go to isaacl.dev/links, and that'll take you to all of the places where I've decided to put my name. So I got too many of them at this point. But I'm looking forward to my guest today. We were having a really good chat, and I'm glad that the top of the hour came because I think we can continue that conversation here. So today, I'm really excited. My guest is Kee Jefferys. Kee, do you want to say hello? Introduce yourself.
Yeah, hey, nice to be here. I work on Session. I'm one of the original founders and kind of work more on the technical side of things. So yeah, happy to have a chat and go through Session and what I've been involved in 7 years. So yeah,
Yeah.
good to be here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it, and we're gonna talk about Session a lot, like we were talking before we got started, and hopefully we won't, maybe we will like reiterate that conversation. At least it'll be recorded. But I always love starting my conversations with like how you got started. Like, did you realize at a young age, or when did you realize that technology was like the thing that you wanted to work on and just be a part of in general?
I think I've been interested in computers since like from a very young, from a gaming perspective. Like I
Sure.
guess that's how I, time on computers when I was, in my teenage years and younger than that.
Hmm.
So I just spent a lot of time on computers. And I think like when you spend a lot of time on if you have that technical inclination, you find a way to mix your kind of hobbies with the technical computer interest. So, it might have been like running a Minecraft server or something and like learning how that worked, building a website and putting that up online. Those were kind of my early experiences with tech and just getting very interested in how some of the privacy enhancing tools worked online as well. So stuff like Tor
Hmm.
and Bitcoin as well, to a certain piqued my interest, from my early teenage years until later,
Yeah.
when I was 18.
Yeah, no, so I think a lot of us in technology, like we kind of ascend to tech because of gaming. I think like depending on when you were a kid, like certain games kind of come top of mind. Like you mentioned talking about like Minecraft servers and things like that. So you're a little bit younger than me. But like do you remember like the first game that you played that you were like enthralled with, like obsessed, like could not stop playing it?
I think for me, really interested in real-time strategy games. So
Okay.
I think maybe one of the early Command and
Okay.
Conquer games I remember playing a lot of, and then I was,
Mm-hmm.
sprinkled in there as well. Those are the first games that I remember being really interested in.
Yeah, Age of Empires was kind of my thing too. And then a lot of my friends started playing StarCraft, and just wasn't good at it. Like I couldn't do the hotkeys fast enough, like cuz in order to be good at
Yeah,
StarCraft, you got to like do all the hotkeys, and I just was never good at it.
it's
So
all
I
about your actions per minute, like
yeah,
how many, you get 100 actions per minute.
yeah,
You watch some of those high-level StarCraft players, and they're just like the amount of things that they're like seamlessly managing. It's
yeah.
insane.
Also, like it's funny because I'd watch some of these videos, and it would seem like there would be like the first 5 or 10 minutes of a match was always the same because people are trying to level up as fast as
Yeah.
possible. They're trying to get resources as fast as possible. So it's just like the same 5 minutes of keystrokes like on repeat, and I just always thought like that doesn't seem very fun. And then I think that at that point in time in my life, I realized that like if you're a professional gamer, it's a job. You probably enjoy it, but it's not fun anymore. Whereas if you're a recreational gamer, like you do it with your friends and you have a good time. But when money's involved, I think like all things, things start to get less exciting when money becomes involved.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, like when I was kind of 16 or 17, I remember getting really deep into League of Legends
Oh, okay.
and like actually like ranking up like quite high
Sure.
because they have this like ranked system. So I got to like the diamond level, which back then was like quite an achievement. but I think like I started to get the same feeling. Like it started to be a bit grindy, and especially like as you start to get up to the higher levels, it's all of this like kind of
Mm-hmm.
macro game
Yeah.
management that you need to like think about. And then I think League of Legends is like quite interesting because you're playing on teams. So you have, you know, 4 other players, including yourself, on one team. And then there's another team with 5 players. So you can feel like you don't actually have
Sure.
much
Yeah.
control over a game. Whereas with StarCraft, like
Yeah.
it's usually just you against another player. So it has a bit more of a, I suppose, like there's a mapping of
Yeah.
responsibility, I think, like to your level of play. Like if you do something results, whereas like with some of the team-based games, it's like, you know, you can be playing on your like your best and still lose just because like, you know, some of your teammates like made issues or had issues. Maybe just someone on the other team is like playing really poorly, and that means like that you win, but you didn't actually play well
Yeah.
yourself. Like,
No, it's once another person becomes involved, things get, pretty interesting. So like you were mentioning about like the delegation of work, right? Like, oh, you're responsible for doing this and you're responsible for doing this. Like even like my wife and I will play like Overcooked, which is a silly game on Xbox where it's like you're inside of a kitchen, right? And it's like we're doing this to like, de-stress and kind of spend time together, and we're like screaming at each other because like the dishes need to get washed and like you need like it's just one of those
yeah,
things where it's just like, okay, all right. It just really shows like the flaws in like working together sometimes as individuals. Like, oh, like go and wash the dishes. Well, I'm chopping. I can't wash dishes at this exact moment. We need dishes in. Anyway, that's a different rant for a different day about my wife and I's
I would
Overcooked
like
game.
if you wanna de-stress, I'd say Overcooked is probably the
No.
worst game.
Yeah, yeah,
I've tried
yeah.
playing with other people as well, and it's just like, yeah, you end up in like a screaming match, and then not a screaming match, but like then you're also like doing these like post game like
Yeah.
recaps, like, oh, okay, like the reason that we failed there is thing and this thing. It's just like
Yeah.
I prefer to play
Yeah.
an easier game, especially like with my friends and family.
Yeah, no, it's it is pretty like it's in the, and I don't want to spend the next hour talking about Overcooked, but like I just love how like the first couple of like levels or whatever you want to call them, they're fairly easy, and then it goes, and then like you
Yeah,
fall off the face of the earth like very quickly. Like once like more responsibilities start getting added up, like I think before you start having to do dishes, it's like super easy, or before you
yeah,
have to like cook rice. It's like, so like there add these levels of complexity, and like it happens like episode like level like 4 or 5 where my wife and I are just like, this is no longer fun. This is like stressful. This is like an episode of the Bear on TV. I don't know if you've ever seen the television show The Bear.
yeah,
Yeah, it's like that, right? People just screaming at
yeah.
each
I
other.
feel like it's you're right. Like in the first couple of levels, you can kind of just isolate yourself.
Yeah,
Like, okay, well, I'll just do this station, or I'll just do these 2 things, and then you do the other 2 things, and that works pretty well. But then, like by level 4 or 5, you actually need to start like handing over tasks
yeah,
to people. Like, you can't just stay on one station the
yeah,
entire time. Like,
yeah.
you need to like start swapping in the middle, and that like becomes a challenge in itself.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating study in like how humans work together. I'd imagine that somebody right now is like writing a thesis on how Overcooked is like damaging for relationships or something like that. Um, so yeah, so like so you started out, your introduction to technology was like via gaming. Like when did you realize there was it was like there was a career path or like a professional path for it?
Well, I think at that point, like when I turned 18, I was quite like in computer networks and security,
Okay,
and I think that field was kind of just emerging, like kind of network
sure.
security and like network administration and stuff. Like this was starting to become a bigger and bigger
Hmm.
field. So I thought, okay, this is an interesting way to find both like what I'm interested in from a network side of things, and then also like, it's a good career path in terms of we're always going to need like,
Yeah,
security individuals and companies to protect networks. So I thought, okay, like let's go do computer science at university. And I think that's like when I started to get a bit more breadth, like my programming picked up. after that, because I hadn't really programmed extensively before. It was more like administration
Mm.
side of things. But like when I learned my first programming language in university, that really opened my eyes in terms of what is possible, and being able to build things. Never really been mechanically minded, like,
Okay.
or super good with like building things in the physical world. But I thought like, oh, okay, like if you can get like good at building things in a computer, you're not really resource like bound to the
Sure.
same extent that you are in the physical world. Like I have to go to like the hardware store and buy
Yeah.
materials and like together. In the computer world, like everything is kind of available for you, and you can build whatever you want without the same resource limitations. So I thought that that was like a very interesting perspective, and motivated me to get more involved in the software side as well.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating because if you talk to people that have been in networking for a long time, a lot of them started out on the hardware side and they moved over eventually to the software side as, problems became more complex, right? And it's interesting to see that like you hit this very specific time of networking where it's like, okay, well, a lot of the tools are available via the CLI or via some API or something, right? Um, you know, I'm curious as somebody that, you were in university a little bit later than I was, like what was the typical curriculum? Like what's the like for networking? Because I remember networking when I was in school was like very low level. Like you had to worry about sockets and you had to worry about all these like very low level sort of things. Is it still like that to an extent, or is a lot of that stuff like obfuscated or abstracted away and like you're worrying about things more like at an API or interface level?
I think they still, like at least the course that I did, they still covered the very low level like nature of computers and networking as well. It was like I remember that in my first semester that I did really good. So I mean, not so much on the programming side. Like they taught us Java, at that point, which is a little bit outdated at this point. I suppose if you want to work on enterprise software or something, it may, as an intro to programming, probably like teaching people Python or JavaScript or something like this is a little bit more applicable. And there wasn't as much kind of interaction with APIs and like interaction with libraries, which I think is probably the most important thing to teach people early on, because once someone can connect to an API library, like it really extends
Yeah.
like the capabilities that they can get involved in. It was more just kind of learning the basics of programming languages. In terms of like the computer networks course, though, that was really good because they kind of built you up from the most base of computers, like logic gates and XORs and like stuff like this, and then you would kind of go to the next level, which was maybe like building your own compiler and like bytecode, and then you would go to like the next learning of kind of basic programming language, and then you would kind of go up the stack until you got to like web applications,
Yeah.
which are using all of this technology underneath. So I thought that that was a good way to teach it. The networking side, yeah, was still did cover like a lot of like ports and IP addresses and the physical layers of the internet. So that was good as well.
Yeah, no, it's pretty fascinating, like because again, if you talk to older folks, it's always like, they were living in server rooms or they were living in data centers and they were running cable and now, everything is an interface. Like you have some UI that you go and you manage and you can look at all of your telemetry and you can see everything at a really high level. And sure, like if you need to go and touch some hardware, you can, but like there are entire career paths now that like you're quote unquote like a networking person, but you never touch physical hardware at all because, just that like a lot of these disciplines have kind of fractured into like so many different like niches within like an area of study, right? Like I just think about like being a software engineer, right? Like does the software engineer mean like you're writing code? Does it mean that you're a site reliability engineer? Does it mean that you're a DevOps administrator and engineer? Like so on and so forth. And that's just not even considering like what you're building. Like are you a front end developer? Are you a back end developer? Are you quote unquote full stack, right? It's like, technology has fractured so much that like now it's hyper specialized. And the reason why I kind of did that little rant there, I'm curious is from your perspective, like you were interested in the networking stuff, um, but eventually you got to the point where you're actually like building like apps, right? So like when did you start to think about like building, you know, not like consumer products or products for people that just didn't like interface with networking tools?
Well, so I think like I was in university at the time,
Sure.
and we had this like the university actually had this program where they sent you out into industry, which I think was really good. Um, they sent you basically to a company, and you like were there for 6 months, and you evolved, and then you didn't need to do your like university semester. That counted as like the semester for that period of time, which was really good because you got sent out into these companies where usually like smaller size companies where you're dealing with physical like network stuff. So I remember going to the network room and like getting involved with the switches and VLAN and all of that stuff, and like getting involved hands on in the hardware. But like I was able to kind of move around in that company a bit and like go inside and work with some of the DevOps engineers and work on the system administration team. So I kind of got a view of everything, like from going into that company, and also like a real world view of like what was happening, which can often be like quite separated from what you're actually learning at university.
Yeah.
After that, like I mean, early on in our course, one of our kind of lecturers was talking about cryptography as well, so asymmetric encryption, and Bitcoin was an interesting application of asymmetric cryptography. And I'd heard about Bitcoin before, but I hadn't really got into it deeply. But after he had mentioned that, I started to kind of go to all of these Bitcoin
Mm.
meetups, and that's where I met like a lot of the other co-founders working on Session. So
Okay.
at that time, like a year and a half into my course, we essentially like I dropped out or deferred, but I haven't gone back yet.
Sure. Sure.
Um, and we started thinking about, okay, like we've seen a lot of this like interesting technology on the privacy space. How can we combine a few of these technologies and build something that would be interesting to users? So
Hmm.
that's when we actually started working on what eventually became Session. I don't think we had this like vision that it was going to be an application, more that we were kind of building a network
Yeah.
which could have applications on top of it. But it eventually then turned into like, okay, now we're working mostly on
Yeah.
on the application
Yeah,
side
no,
of
we were
things.
talking about this a little before we get started, so we can kind of rehash that conversation. Like the idea that you were trying to build kind of like a platform or a framework to like tap into some of these different things that you were looking into. And then eventually, like one of the things that you built, maybe as a proof of concept, was like this messaging app. And then the messaging app became the thing that kind of took like the most interest from folks. I'd like to kind of take a step back and like you mentioned that you deferred your education, right? And um I'd love to like what like I'm curious as what led you to make that decision, and then as a follow-up, like the people around you that maybe weren't 100% tapped into like your thought process, like what was the perception? And it's like, oh, Key, you're dropping out of school to like build some tech thing. Okay, that let's see how that goes.
Yeah, I feel like everyone around me was pretty open to it. I mean, at this point, like it's a fairly common path in tech to
Sure.
be,
Yeah.
a dropout and start your own companies. So, like, I think it's not totally out of the convention. I mean, from my perspective, there was a large opportunity here that
Hmm.
maybe wasn't going to be around in the next couple of years. And I thought, oh, okay, well, I can defer for at least
Okay.
3 years and then come back to computer science if I want to. But I think like these opportunities don't present themselves all the time. And I think like, especially if you're young, it's good to kind of grab those opportunities and ride with them, even if it doesn't work out in the end. Like you end up with a lot of
Sure.
experience, and then you're not necessarily like you can always kind of
Yeah.
going before. So it felt like a no-brainer to me. And like my parents and stuff weren't that like
Sure.
pissed off
Sure.
about it. They were just like, okay, this seems cool. Like you can come back to things later
Yeah.
if you want.
No, and that's I think that's pretty healthy. Like I think one of the things that I'm not trying to compare you to anybody, but like you said, it's like there are well documented cases of people like deferring their education because they have an idea they just can't wait on. And one of the things that's interesting about like what you're talking about is that you know a lot of the stuff that you were probably thinking about at the time was like not like how do I get rich as fast as possible, right? Which I think, maybe for some folks is like a huge incentive to like want to kind of get this stuff to market. But like I think that you just saw a gap and like obviously kind of extend on this, but you saw a gap in where things were going and where things currently were, and you're like, hey, like why can't I build something like this?
Yeah, exactly. And I think like the work that Session does has always been, you would say like maybe not one of the most like profitable like industries. Like we
Sure.
probably could have gone into AI or something, I mean, not that AI was big at the time, but there were other like technologies which people were really interested in. There was a lot of money like flowing around in those ecosystems. But I think like the kind of human rights perspective of like being able to provide people additional
Mm-hmm.
privacy, human rights in terms of like, journalists and whistleblowers and activists, of being able to connect with those people and see that the work that you're doing actually has an effect on those individuals, I think is like very fulfilling. And that's always been from my side, like I've always been kind of inspired by, the cypherpunks and kind of some of the early people around Bitcoin, like Ross Ulbricht and Satoshi and Julian Assange, and getting to build something that like is similar in terms of like providing people with freedom and following kind of more libertarian values has always been like
Sure.
an interest for me
Yeah, and I
personally.
mean I think that there's something to say. It's like we were talking about this before we get started, and I don't want to like dive straight up into like session, like in what it does and all of that. Like I think there's opportunity to do that, but it's like if you want to send a message to somebody, like there are a few things that a lot of existing apps require, right? They want your phone number, or they want your email address, or they want some personal identifiable information in order to like register you as an identity. And like you just gave like a handful of many examples of folks that like, hey, maybe having my my personal phone number, or even like any like phone number that's registered to me like out there in the world, like in some database somewhere, is problematic. uh I think one of the things I'd like to talk about too is like the origin of session, because like you mentioned, like we talked a little bit about, it wasn't the initial idea. So you want to talk a little bit about the history of like you and the co-founders idea of like this, you know, this framework, and talk about what you like, what thought process you went through as you kind of turned it into like this idea to an actual entity.
Yeah, so like we started in 2018, and the idea there was we were very interested in cryptocurrency. We saw a lot of issues that Bitcoin doesn't provide very good privacy. It provides, a level of pseudo anonymity, but when you send a transaction, it's on chain and know, where you're sending funds. And I think like from that perspective, like Monero, which is a
Sure.
different, private cryptocurrency, really interested us. And at the same time, so very interested in decentralized networks like Tor, where you could kind of spin up these nodes, and you'd have this decentralized network of nodes, which would traffic and then provide them anonymity as well. So the initial idea was kind of, what if we combined the incentive system that a cryptocurrency can provide in a decentralized way with the decentralized nature of something like Tor, and you could kind of incentivize nodes to operate in this network, and then you could use those nodes to perform kind of interesting functionality, whether that be or building decentralized applications on top of that set of nodes. It's like the cryptocurrency world has been really good at building the supply side of
Sure.
decentralized networks. So if you think about like what the biggest computer network is in the entire world, you might think like AWS or one of these cloud providers, but it
Yeah.
is actually Bitcoin. It has the most, even though this hardware isn't really doing anything useful, like it's
Sure.
just
Yeah.
calculating SHA-256 hashes over and over again.
Yeah.
It is like the biggest deployed network. And then you look at like other cryptocurrencies like Ethereum, you can have these kind of node networks which are incentivized. And that was where kind of the original idea of like these two technologies and building a decentralized network that was incentivized and had some civil attack protection, and then kind of developers to develop on top of that. And that was kind of building out the supply side. But I think what we found is like when that network was deployed in 2019, we had built out this massive supply side. We had a lot of nodes on the network, but there wasn't actually that demand side
Sure.
yet abstract for people to understand the idea of a decentralized network and want to write applications on top of that network. So in our original vision, we had always thought, oh, okay, we'll kind of deploy an initial set of applications. And one was like a routing tool, like which was kind of similar to Tor. And then the other was a messaging application, which showed that if you could kind of send messages across this network, then you could build more complex
Yeah.
technology on that later and use that as like a framework. So we put out these two applications, and I think it like very immediately became clear that people were very interested in the messaging application that we had built. And there was a lot of demand for additional features in that application, just because like it uses a completely different like network structure that you've kind of seen before, and offered these like guarantees around message storage, which was rare to have for like a peer-to-peer tool, for example, or a decentralized tool in general. So then we ended up like focusing way more on the building out that application, and we like have kind of continued to improve the network side of things as well, but that's kind of been less in terms of like people want this application, so we're mainly focusing on that at the current point.
No, I mean that makes a ton of sense. I think the one of the things that I, heard you say and I want to kind of follow up on a little bit is like, you one of the canonical applications that you were thinking of building was like a messaging app. And if you've ever built, and developers that listen to the show, like if you've ever had to build like a real-time app at any point in time in your career, it's always probably been like a chat app. That's always like the canonical example of like real-time applications, is because chats are real time. And messaging is kind of like that next level where it's, you're talking about persistence and all these sort of things as well. So I'm curious as to like, you know, I'd imagine that when you and the other people that were working on this, you built the messaging app as kind of like a proof of concept, and then it gets, traction. Your probably first thought was, okay, like the messaging app is the thing that everybody wants, not the framework. Or like maybe not to phrase it like that, but people are far more interested in the messaging app than we expected them to be.
Yeah, exactly. Like, and I think that is like the trap that a lot of these decentralized networks get kind of put into, is that you build this decentralized network, but then like it's hard to actually get application
Sure.
developers to come and build in a new paradigm, because, and especially now, because a lot of people are so used to not having to deal with a network where you don't have the same guarantees as like just having a sub where you can fetch messages and send messages, and you don't have to worry about the network side of things. So I think it was harder to bring people into that paradigm. Obviously, like because we had built the network, and all the technology behind it, we understood the network and what we couldn't provide. So building applications on top of that ourselves was, I think, much easier than if you're a new developer kind of coming into the ecosystem and trying to build on top of things. So yeah, like when we launched the application though, like it was pretty widely, people were very interested in the model. I think
Sure.
at that time when we launched that in 2020, I don't think that there had been a decentralized network which offered kind of message storage. So
Yeah.
you had a lot of peer-to-peer messaging applications kind of going around. So stuff like Talks was getting popular, or it was getting a little bit of popularity at least in the kind of more tech focused side of things. But you didn't yet have a something that wasn't purely peer to peer, where you could send messages to someone when they were offline. They would be stored for a period of time because you have this incentive network behind the scenes. And then, when a user comes back online, they can fetch their messages back. So there was kind of a bit of a spot in the market where, you could have decentralization, but then you could also have message storage guarantee. And I think that was quite interesting for a lot of people because the application felt more like a traditional messaging application,
Yeah.
even though it had that centralized element to it.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. I think you've seen like in the last 5 years, specifically, like these things have been around for a while, like torrents and things like that, where it's everything's a bit decentralized. But now I think, like I said, in the last 5 years, like there's been an emphasis like in the public space or like the pop culture space of like decentralization, like obviously decentralization of social media platforms, decentralization of identity with like the stuff that like Block is doing, the what you're doing at Session, right? Like, you know, and I think one of the things that I've always struggled with as somebody that's like somewhat technical, like, trying to explain what decentralized actually means to somebody that probably doesn't care but would get value out of the product, right? So when you talk about, I imagine if if you're at a party or if you're hanging out with family or whatever, and people are like, so what do you do? And you talk about Session and you talk about decentralized messaging and people's eyes glaze over, like how do you try to explain this concept to people?
I typically, like, when I'm explaining Session to someone who hasn't heard about it before, I'm typically just focusing on the
Okay.
features that it provides. So the first thing, and I think the thing that's been most interesting to people, is where you don't need your phone number or your email address.
Yeah.
And that's huge for a lot of people because I think a lot of people have an innate understanding of, oh, like if I link my phone number to my
Yeah.
messaging service and I use my phone number in a million other locations, then that has an effect on my
Yep.
privacy, like privacy that I'm able to get by using the application. So that's usually the first point I touch on. Then I usually either go into like the fact that the network is kind of censorship resistant. So there isn't a single network, which means that there isn't, if you shut down one of the nodes, there's other nodes that will come back and still you'll still have your messages. And I think, with a lot of the censorship that's been going on kind of social media, people understand the reason that could be interesting.
Hmm.
And then I usually talk about onion routing as well, which is another
Yep.
system that we use. And I typically like try to refer to it as like a more private version of a VPN, for
Yeah.
example. And most people have like some understanding of what a VPN is doing. It's like kind of hiding your IP address and allowing you to like go to a different location. Um, and kind of touching on that and the fact that like a lot of messaging applications, WhatsApp, your signals, they're actually getting access to your IP address when you connect to those servers, and that's a lot of metadata for them to have. So yeah, I typically try to break it down from those levels. I don't usually talk about like how storage
Sure.
works in
Sure.
this decentralized
Yeah.
network, for example.
That's fair. And maybe as somebody that's just curious by nature, I'm like, oh, like I imagine that people need to know how it works at all times when probably they really don't. But like you mentioned a couple of like other like players in this space, and like I think that's probably it might be valuable to kind of talk about the different levels of privacy from like a messaging solution, right? So like at the top level, like the least private would be, like your messaging app that's built into your phone number, right? Like if you use iMessage or Google Messages or whatever. And then like one step down is like your WhatsApp or Telegrams or Signals of the world, right? That's like, hey, you can maybe use a phone number, maybe not use a phone number, but you need to use an email address if not. And like, they provide some value like end-to-end encryption or whatever. And then there's like that another level down, which I believe Session is, where it's like, hey, like all PII, like no, like let's not focus on that. Let's focus on security and privacy. and this decentralized way of, sharing the burden instead of like it all going through the Signal servers or the WhatsApp servers or what have you.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think of it. I mean, like there are these levels that people kind of like descending levels in terms of, privacy. And, at the top level, you're probably talking about kind of raw SMS
Sure.
or like email, which is like, typically completely unencrypted, or encrypted maybe to like your telecom provider, but then they can read everything. These systems are like extremely insecure, but are like the backbone to a lot of different
Yeah.
technologies. And then you kind of go down to, okay, like you're talking about messaging applications now, and then it's about, okay, do they deploy end-to-end encryption by default? So like in the first tier, I would kind of put like Telegram, for example, doesn't end-to-end encrypt by
Yeah.
default. So the average user who isn't using secret chats, which is like their end-to-end encryption feature, like everything is readable by the Telegram servers. Then like maybe you drop another level and you would put kind of WhatsApp maybe and some other messaging applications in this tier where they are using end-to-end encryption, but they're pretty heavy on the metadata side and have connections with Facebook and these companies that are well known to
Sure.
collect users' metadata. And then like maybe you have Signal underneath that, where it's like end-to-end encrypted. The company has a very good history of protecting people's metadata, but they still
Mm-hmm.
do have access to users' metadata if they wanted it. And then I think like on the lowest like level, you have kind of these new class of messaging applications which are very focused on privacy. So you'd probably put like Session, maybe SimpleX, Threema. There's a few others that you could kind of put in that tier of like very much focusing on privacy and trying to minimize the metadata that's available like as much as possible.
Yeah, I think one of the things too that I think about, there's that old adage where it's like if you're not paying for something, you're the product, right? So like, especially like when you go higher up the stack, like you're paying a little bit of with accessibility by, you're trading your data for accessibility more or less. Like that's how I've always seen it, like with email or, SMS or even RMS or whatever, right? Um, but then you go down the line and like let's just call it out. Like session it right now is free, right? Like it's free for the end user. So like the question always becomes, it's like, okay, so like how does it work? Because at the end of the day, like it very much is like you have a company. That company needs to make money. Eventually it will need to make money, and there's probably enterprise solutions and things like that. But like I'm always curious when like you get so decentralized to the fact that it's like, oh no, like we don't really collect any monetary value from our end users. Then the question I always ask in my head is like, okay, so how long are you going to be around before you can't like run it anymore?
Question to ask as well. Like Session itself is a
Yeah.
non-profit, so it's not really profit driven from that perspective. But there's developers in the company who need to be paid, and you need to think about that side. The long-term solution for Session, and the thing that I've always been most interested in terms of monetization models, is a freemium style model. So this is also what Telegram uses as well. You can sign up for Telegram, use it for free. But they have what's called Telegram Premium, which is essentially like a subscription. It's $4.99 a month, and that then offers you more features if you're a power user, for example. So that could be stuff like increased file uploads, more profile customizability, to have larger groups. There's just like a whole list of features which make the
Sure.
application more usable to power users. And the goal there is then like, okay, you're trying to monetize maybe 2 to 3% of your user base. And through that monetization, you can
Yeah.
make that's using the application for free. I think like this is a fairly non-extractive like model. You're not kind of having people pay for privacy. You're just having them like pay for more kind of convenience and user base that you have that are real power users and want to support the network. So I think from my perspective, I think that is the best model for session, and that's kind of the pathway that session is going down as well.
No, and I think it's also like safe to say, like, because of the fact that because of how the technology works, like at least you don't have like a huge infrastructure cost monthly, right? Like
Yes.
if you were hosting servers and you were a centralized service, like, and you were paying for storage and paying for egress networking out of your data centers and all of this, like you would probably not, to this day, like you said, 2018, so 7 years later, you would no longer be in business for a lot of reasons,
Yeah.
but one being like cost of ownership and cogs and cost of goods sold, right? Like,
It's
so
it's
yeah,
crazy. Like Signal recently published a blog with some of their like costs per year, and I think like yearly, like on their server bills, like all of their infrastructure, all of their developers, I think it's coming to nearly $50 million a year, like to run Signal, and that's just an insane level of
yeah,
costs. And you obviously like we wouldn't be able to like
sure,
shoulder that burden for
yeah,
7 years. That would be an extremely high amount of money. But then, like, if you look at the design of the network, things that session doesn't need to pay for. So, for example, I think one of Signal's like biggest costs is actually like the SMS verification messages that
sure,
users get when they sign up. It's like I think they were paying like $6 or $7 million for that per year, and that's cost that session just doesn't
yeah,
have. You don't need a phone number to sign up for session. And then, yeah, as you were speaking about, like running a network of 2,300 decentralized nodes,
yeah,
if you were to run that all yourself, like the server bills would rack up like
yeah.
very quickly. But that cost is like ameliorated on the network, and then there's like an incentive for that network as well. So I think like from that perspective, it does give session as a whole like a competitive
Yeah,
advantage.
no, it's fascinating to me too, because like you're kind of, I mean, this it's like also decentralized sort of things. You're kind of stealing energy and stealing compute from your external your remote nodes, right? Like there's somebody who is running something like just doing their day, living their life, right? And you're just stealing their compute, but they're signing up for it because they like the service, which I think is always really cool. And like you said, like the libertarian view of things, which I think is pretty fascinating. Um, one thing too that I would like to talk about just very briefly is like, you know, one of the things that whenever I've talked about these sort of things, whether it's crypto, whether it's, you mentioned like Tor, like the onion routing, like even session, right? Like, you know, I immediately, because I'm in the pop culture space, I kind of immediately assess these things sometimes to being um, accessible by bad actors, right? Like, and I'm by no means saying that people that are doing bad things are using session, because I don't think that's true. I mean, I think that's true about it. Like everybody like bad people use everything. I think that's a better way to phrase that. And I'd love to get your thoughts as to like how what you think about in that regard, and like how are you in the company working to kind of make sure those things aren't as prevalent on your platform.
Yeah. So like from a personal perspective, my view on this has always been kind of more from the
Sure.
utilitarian perspective. So, if you're talking about a network that has 1 million users, like what portion of those users are using the network for, malicious
Sure.
purposes versus like what portion are using it for, trying to preserve their human rights activists, in Iran, and they're trying to organize a protest, or they're a whistleblower and they're trying to leak sensitive information against a despotic government. And I think as long as like your balance on that is like far towards the side of like good
Sure.
users versus malicious users, then I think like that makes me feel good about like developing the technology, as opposed to like if the users were malicious users,
Yeah.
then I would feel like, oh, this is not the right way. We should be developing technology. So that's always been my balance personally. In terms of like what the company does and how like the Session Foundation looks at this, I think like we're always interested, or like the STF is always interested in terms of how can we design features such that they're hard to misuse
Mm.
in the wrong
Okay.
way. So like if you look at some of the features in session, because people don't have identities, we have this kind of, or they have these identities which are able to be spun around really quickly. We have implemented systems like message requests or friend request systems where someone messages you, you have to kind of explicitly
Yes.
accept that message
Yeah.
from them. So, if someone's just trying to like spam you with like junk, it kind of goes into this separate inbox. You don't really see it, and then you have to like accept to get that person to come through. Or like think about discoverability on the network. Like, do you want people to be able to search any group on the network that they want? Because that has kind of potential for misuse. If you have a bad group, then it can spread really
Yeah.
quickly around the network. Or do you want people to have to kind of explicitly be invited to things? So I have a group, I explicitly have to send an invite, so you can't just kind of join it willy-nilly. So those are some of like the design considerations, and every feature that's put into session, it's considered from a perspective of how could this be misused. The design is like kind of approached from a perspective of reducing or minimize use, and then like at the end of the day, you're kind of getting towards some like features and a feature set which is more useful for the good rather than the bad
Yeah.
actors.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really it's a really great way to phrase it and a good approach too, because I think, like I think you said it pretty clearly. Like the utilitarian view is like it's a very small percentage of people that are using these things for bad things, right? Like, and you can say that about text messaging, you can say that about email, you can say that about everything, right? You could use that like every big company's got bad actors that are trying to manipulate it to some extent. And I think one of the things that like I really appreciate about what you just said is that like trying to add features that good actors want to use, not bad actors can look to exploit, which I think is something that's really interesting. And I think one of the things that I'm really fat as we start to kind of wrap up the conversation is like, what are some of the things around session and around this space that, is interesting to you that hasn't officially like been brought to fruition yet? Like we mentioned, like you talked about AI, for instance, right? Like, is session going to have an AI mode, like, or a session GPT or whatever? Like, obviously, all jokes aside, like, what are some of the things that you see in the future in this space?
Yeah, I think the AI point is interesting. There could possibly be an integration there. I mean, most people are using these chat bots and they're interacting with them via a web interface where they're kind of leaking their IP address, for example, or they signed up for the service with their email. It would be interesting to have an AI chatbot that you could talk to in session,
Yeah.
for example, where you're not revealing all of your personal information. Bot. I think that could be an interesting integration. I mean, that's like what excites me from a session perspective, like unreleased features and stuff, are more just getting session and act as much as possible like a centralized messaging application.
Yeah.
So we have really kind of, sessions really focused on, or its user base is built of mostly kind of more hardcore privacy individuals, like more techie, like kind of focused individuals. And I think a lot of that is because of the way that session has developed and the way that the features like feel to users. Like session feels, I think, a bit slower in terms of like the speed to send a message. There's still a bit of a barrier to entry, and you get this 12-word seed which you need to back up, and your identity on the network is this long string of kind of unidentifiable or
Sure.
non-human readable characters. Like starting to reduce some of those barriers, making the network much faster so that when you send a message, it feels like it's like being sent immediately because the network is so reliable and so quick that you're not really trading off anymore between like speed and privacy. And then it becomes like becomes an easier sell, I think, to a lot of users. It's like you're not losing
Yeah.
anything by moving to session. Actually, you're just gaining privacy. So like from that perspective, I think that's what it is. It's just like when people sign up to session, they should get all of the privacy benefits, but they shouldn't be having to trade off on speed or reliability or like complexity.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of like solutions that can come in to like resolve some of those things.
Yeah, no, I that's great to hear that Like this is just something to think about. And then I want to ask like one question just as a test, right? Like, you mentioned like trying to like get, make it be like let session become more accessible for folks, right? And I'd imagine there's probably conversations you folks have all the time about like concessions that you could make to make the app or the platform more accessible. And I think my question for you is like, is there a line in the sand that you're very much just like, there's some concessions that I would make to make this more accessible and maybe increase overall user base? Or it's like, no, I think we're pretty set in stone and we can continue to add interesting things in this space without making any concessions at all.
I don't know if there's like an explicit line in the sand which has been drawn, because I think that's kind of limits the way that you think to a certain extent. But everyone who is in the company or who works on session as a contributor, I think has a shared ideology about
Yeah,
preserving people's privacy and trying to reduce the metadata which goes into the network. So, when you look at stuff like, session could add the ability to, sign up with a phone number, for example. And like, that would resolve a lot of issues, not only on the spam side, but also would allow you to kind of instantly connect with
yeah,
your phone number social graph applications do. Like you sign up with your phone number, and then anyone who's in your contact book on your phone, now you can instantly message them and you can see that they're already on the chat service. So it instantly like bootstraps a work around
hmm,
the messaging application, makes it like a lot easier for people to get involved, like, and then start messaging their friends. But like if we were to add something like that in session, like now you're, kind of trading off like a massive amount of metadata that people need
yeah,
to use, like to put into the application. You're like creating a lot of concern for users about how that phone number is stored, like where is it going to be stored?
yeah,
How do we keep that securely? So I think like that's one of the things that we haven't done, even though it would provide a
yeah,
definite advantage from like growing such a perspective. But you could imagine maybe there's some sort of technology in the future which allows you to do that in a decentralized way and in a privacy preserving. I don't know of that technology
yeah,
yet, and I'm not sure it actually exists.
yeah,
But if there was a technology, I wouldn't draw a line in the sand and just say like there's never going to be phone numbers, and like
yeah.
it if it can be done in a secure way. So that's what I mean, like about like ideology trying to drive things rather than like drawing explicit lines in the sand.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And I wasn't trying to do like a gotcha or anything saying like, oh, in 6 months
No,
session's gonna have phone numbers. I think, but like, also there's concessions that you make that are like you were talking about advantages, but they also come with huge disadvantages. Like just as something as simple as adding a phone number or an email address or something like, where's that gonna get stored? Because we talked about the advantages of what you're doing is not having to store anything or storing a very small amount of metadata, right? And when you start talking about like collecting information, like it's got to get stored somewhere. You have to make sure that you're adhering to all of the privacy standards around the world, GDPR, what have you, right? Like it sounds to me like it's more work than it's worth. Like yeah, you'll probably, 10x your user base, but like then you're paying all these additional costs and making all these other concessions too, right? Then you got to get a bunch of lawyers involved. Like it just sounds to me like it's not worth it. It's really not worth it
yeah,
in the grand scheme of things.
yeah, and I think that's the assessment that actually has been made.
Yeah, and I think, you were talking about like, identities, right? Like, or ways to kind of like decentralized ways. Like, I've had some friends of mine on the show that work at Block that, they're trying to solve this like like this idea of like, isn't it a bummer that like your identity is spread across all these different providers and like you have to like basically continually like prove that you exist or prove that you're like the owner of your own data because technically like they own your data and you have to access it, right? So they're trying to kind of, resolve this. Like it's not 100% there yet, but it's one of those things that it's like it's very interesting, especially, for um consumers the session could potentially be, right? Where it's like, oh, if you have like your own, hash key that represents your identity, and then that hash key you can carry it around and give it to different apps to get access, right? Like that's something that's extremely beneficial, like from a privacy perspective.
Yeah, definitely. And that's always been a part of session as well, is this idea of like self-sovereign data ownership. Or,
Yeah,
I mean, well, look, there's one perspective which is like session tries to create as little data as
sure.
possible, which I think is probably the thing that people should be doing. A lot of people are talking about data ownership now, but if you're really looking for privacy, you want to like not create the data in the first place
Yeah,
and not just worry about the ownership side of it. But yeah, session access to this like 12 or 13 word, recovery
yep,
password is what we call it. It's like 13 random words. And as long as you know that, you can completely delete your session account off your device, and you can take that 13
yep.
words and restore that on another device, and you can get back your account. So it's always been this idea of portability. I think the interesting thing there is like, okay, we have portability, but we maybe like session doesn't really have the best interoperability, for example. Make it so that, you know, identities that are generated in other systems can potentially be brought into session, or so that sessions, are compatible with other services. So
Yeah.
I think there is like definitely some standardization that's going on there. Um, but I don't think it's kind of reached the point where everyone is on like one kind of decentralized identity standard
Sure.
yet.
And I also think too, it's like, you're talking about like the data perspective, right? Like, oh, do I own my own data? And I think the question becomes like, you see this a lot in social media platforms. It's like the social media platform starts to get a bit unhinged, and then everybody wants to get all of their data off the platform, right? And it's like it becomes this huge operation of like, okay, I got to get down all of my posts, I got to get down all my media because I don't want to be on this platform anymore, but I want to keep some of the content, right? And I think it's very interesting, like from a messaging standpoint, like maybe there's a very small like set of cases where it's like I want like copies of all of the messages and all the media that I've sent, but I'd imagine for a lot of people they would just rather not have that information, right? And I'm curious to know your thoughts. Like, what is that balance from like a data sovereignty perspective? Like, do you see a lot of people wanting to keep like historical archivals of their chats, or is it something that maybe just like I said, like a small use case of people would end up using?
I think it's definitely something that more technical users want to have the ability to do. So like to be able to example
Sure.
of, all of the messages you've sent, all of the attachments that you've ever sent. I think, kind of more normal users just expect that
Yeah.
the service will hold their information and that there's some method to delete it, but they don't really expect the ability to be able to import and export across messaging applications yet. I think the EU is working on regulations which force messaging applications to kind of be a bit more interoperable with each other so that you can move more easily between different messaging applications. I think that's going to be very tricky to achieve. Like
For
one
some
of
companies
the
specifically, yeah.
intuitions,
For some companies specifically, it's going to be very challenging.
yeah. But I think just in general, like the intuition around messaging applications and the intuition I had when we started working on Session was that, oh, messaging is like actually a very easy like thing to do. It's like because I think what you're talking about is like a very simple real-time chat application before, and they kind of extend we kind of extended our mind. Oh, I can build like a simple real-time chat application. Like so it can't be that hard to like build something that's more
Sure.
complex. But actually, I think messaging applications are one of the most complex softwares that we use day to day in terms of like all of the integrations that they
Yeah.
have with other services. So like, MS Teams, for example, docs integration and voice like
Sure.
calls and file attachments and disappearing messages. And like you just stack these like orders of complexity on top of things. And I think then and just like think also about like the different messaging applications we use. Most people probably use like, 3 or 4 messaging applications at least. They might use something with their friends and family. They might use Slack. They might use something when they play games, and then they might use something else to communicate with, via text message with their like grandparents or something. And like each of these messaging applications is kind of making different trade-offs and different
Yeah.
integrations. So to get everything to be cross-compatible with each other, it's like actually a very, very tricky problem to resolve. And then you have like all the security and privacy implications of like interoperability as well. So it's a very interesting field there.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. Like, it seems to me, and I think this is a great way to end it. It's like there's kind of two players in this space, right? There is the biggest companies in the world, and there are small companies they're either nonprofits or they're very small organizations that like they care very much about a particular set of features and a specific rights as a user, and they just drill into those. And those are kind of the two segments. And probably there's some stuff in the middle too, but for the most part, it's the five largest companies in the world, and then folks like Session. And it's kind of interesting to me because, you know, as somebody who is curious about different spaces and like what causes somebody, that's why I was so curious about like why you wanted to get into this space, because you mentioned how complicated it is, right? And like the upside isn't immense unless you are creating some new protocol or something, right? But I think that there's something to say, like you were mentioning about like the libertarian view of things, where it's like look, let's be real. Messaging apps are they're all commodities. Like to end users, there's an expectation of a set of features, and if your app or if your platform doesn't provide those set of features, like we were talking about earlier, you're probably not going to get as much market share. And some companies decide to make concessions. Okay, oh, we're not going to do this, but we know that it's going to make this other segment of our potential user base way happier. So like I'd love to end it on this, like, what is the one thing that you think that your users, your session users, like obviously privacy and security, but like what's the thing they think they care about the most and why they came to session for it?
I think like in order of priority, in terms of a ranking system here, most users care that session doesn't require
Sure.
a phone number or an email address or some sort of real world identity. That's definitely the top thing. The second, either the fact that the network is decentralized and censorship from the protocol level, or the fact that session uses onion routing and hides your IP address when you send a message on session. So I think it's like those last two are definitely like interchangeable. Some people care more about the central and more about the kind of privacy aspect of not revealing your IP address to the network, like when you use session. So I think like, yeah, in order of priority, it's like phone numbers, onion routing, decentralization.
Not that that makes a lot of sense. And I think, as like I mentioned to you before we got started, like I use session, like I wanted to play around with it because I do get pretty exhausted of putting like my phone number or my email address into stuff. And I was just curious. I'm like, okay, how is this experience without any of that? And I will say, like, there's a couple of people that I chat with on session because they said, hey, I use session. I'm like, okay, well, let me just try that. Sometimes it's challenging. Like you were saying, there's a bit of a sprawl, like the amount of messaging platforms you use. But like it's a concession I'm willing to make because I'm curious about this space, and if I have an opportunity to talk to people about session that I know might be okay with the idea, like I mention it. And I think that's it's fascinating to me that there is this space, and we've always just assumed you have to give away some of your data to like do something as simple as like message a friend or a family member or what have you. um, and I'd like to kind of end on this. Like, so, we've talked a lot about this messaging space, obviously, and we've talked a little bit about the future, but I'd love to kind of get your thoughts, in a sentence or two. It's like, what is the thing that excites you most about this space? And like, you're a young guy, like, you could be doing anything, you know? I went to your GitHub. I see how much code you write. Like, you know, what gets you up and like what gets you excited about coming into work every day?
I think for me, it's the humanitarian vision of session, like being able to provide people whistleblowers, journalists, human rights activists the ability to communicate without the fear that someone's watching behind them. I think when people have spaces where they can feel like safe to communicate with their friends and family, and they don't feel like there's this kind of panopticon where they're being surveilled, their range of thinking that they can use like just becomes a lot wider. Like if you thought that someone had a security camera on you at like 24/7, it like kind of constrains the way that you can think about things because you're always worried, oh, what if I have like the wrong thought or like something that I say is like not kosher or something like that. It kind of constrains the way that we think. And I think session offers a way to, communicate with your friends without needing to worry about, oh, there's someone like watching all of these chats and like constrain the way that you think. So I think from that perspective and the human rights perspective are like what gets me most excited about coming into session and working on things here.
That's great. I think, you're doing work that I think is quite fascinating, and I want to thank you for taking the time to chat with me. And if folks are interested in learning more about session, I think like first off, like the website it's getsession.org. There'll be a link to it in the show notes. Like highly recommend taking a look at it if you're curious. It's also available on app stores. Also, if you want to follow Kee and see like some of the things that he's working on, you can follow him on X, for instance. So, JEFFERYSKEE. That's one place, and then there'll be some other places that I'll list down in the show notes of ways that you can find him. All right. So, as we wrap up, do you have any parting words or things you'd like to add before we sign off for the evening?
No, I think that was really good. Like, if people want to get involved in session as well, like everything in session is open source, so including the servers, including clients. So if you're interested from a developer perspective, like everything's on GitHub, and you can come and contribute and have a little go at seeing as well. So I'd encourage people to get involved from that perspective if they're interested too.
Yeah, highly recommend because there's lots of C++ code, which you don't see a lot of these days. Like you don't go to a repo that's fairly modern and it's a lot of C++. Like so it was pretty, I was looking at a lot of it and I was like, I haven't looked at C++ in a long time. But it still does the job. And but I want to thank you, Kee, for chatting with me, and it's been great getting to know you a little bit more and learning about what you folks are doing at Session. And I want to thank the folks that are tuning in right now and the folks that are listening in on the future. And this has been great. I appreciate your time and thank you so much. My name is Isaac Levin, and this has been Coffee and Open Source. And hope you enjoy the rest of your day. For my friend Kee, take care.